I'm Philip Keefer. I'm Principal Economic Advisor at the Inter-American Development Bank in the department that's called Institutions for Development. And before that, for about 20 years, I was at the World Bank. Alina asked me to come to this conference about 6 months ago, and I was really happy to say yes. The project and the subject are really important for development. The idea that you can become a more developed, successful country with a lot of corruption hasn't really happened in the past. And I think this is a project that's trying to figure out, so how can you solve corruption problems, but also how can you solve more fundamental development problems that also lead to corruption? I think that's a great agenda. So my involvement in the anti-corp project is a little bit ancillary. There's people who are doing a lot of the hard work and the heavy lifting. My job is more advisory. There's a scientific advisory board of the anti-corp project, and I'm on that. It was very nice of them to invite me to be a part of it. And as a member of the board, I look at documents occasionally that they might send me and try to give comments, but especially I'll come and give comments at this conference, for example, and at the last one in Florence. So there's a lot of work being done on corruption, and then the question is, so what's this project adding to the overall body of work, the anti-corp project? And I think the way to think about that is there's a lot of academic work going on out there that doesn't really touch the policy sphere. And then there's a policy sphere which doesn't really look very much at academic work. It tends to be very concerned about the fiduciary problems of stealing and of theft and the good use of taxpayer money. These are incredibly important objectives. If you want taxpayer to support something, you need to be concerned that the money is going where it's supposed to go. But those kinds of concerns don't really get at the fundamental issues of corruption, which is kind of what the academic literature tries to do. This project is on both sides of that dividing line, trying to bring the academic knowledge of what works with of how to think about corruption to the policy circles, but also bringing a kind of a policy sensitivity to how we should think about the academic work. But at the same time, it's innovating. I think the idea that's coming out, especially in this conference, of linking corruption to the more fundamental issues of particularism. Like, politicians are not just corrupt, but they might be particularistic, which means they're doing things that aren't really to the benefit of the public. Some of which might be just straight out illegal or immoral, which we might think of as corruption, but other things are completely legal and very common, but also aren't really helping development very much either. And looking at this as kind of a more generic phenomenon, I think is an important contribution of the project. The issue is, again, there's been not only are there a lot of research projects on corruption, but there are a lot of conferences about corruption. So what's special about this conference? I think looking at the academic literature, which is what I'm most familiar with, on corruption, what you get is a lot of cross-country comparisons using pretty rough data about who's more corrupt and who's less corrupt. Now, the rough data is, I think, roughly accurate, but you don't really feel very enlightened about the real underlying conditions in countries that are making corruption easier or harder to deal with. And the focus of this conference is largely on country case studies, especially of countries that have succeeded or seem to show an upward beneficial trajectory in terms of corruption. And I think I'm learning a lot about the challenges and the contingent circumstances that allow some countries to address corruption and others not to. So this question of measurement of corruption is an important one. Policymakers are asking this question constantly. My bosses, especially at the World Bank, were really concerned about measuring corruption. And it turns out, after a lot of effort, there's no measure that people are going to buy into, especially at a policy level. It's very hard to get an objective, quantitative measure of corruption because corruption is coming in many different shapes and sizes. It's entering into tremendously heterogeneous transactions from changing a regulation to the benefit of special interest, to getting a teacher to change your grades, to taking a cut of a contract. It's happening at low levels and high levels. It's really almost conceptually, but certainly empirically and physically impossible to get a measure of corruption that's accurately captures differences across countries in all of these things. And I think it's fruitless to keep trying. We've spent a lot of money and a lot of effort trying to get this right. I think what we have, these sort of somewhat objective, somewhat subjective, observer-sensitive measures of corruption, is about as good as it's going to get. So am I happy with those? No, I'm not really happy with it. That's why I think we've probably gone as far as we can in using cross-country measures and cross-country analyses to figure out what helps with corruption and what hurts. Now I think this idea of entering into country-level investigation, which could be quantitative or could be case studies, I think that's the way to go. And in those cases, you tend to be taking advantage of sort of serendipitous, idiosyncratic, but also informative measures of corruption that are locally collected. Just to give one example, Brazil has implemented a series of reforms that one reform in particular was to randomly audit municipalities. So every year, some group of municipalities would be randomly audited, and some of them will be judged as having failed the audit. Now, the failed audit becomes kind of a measure of corruption. It may not be corruption, but who knows? But it's definitely a useful measure of corruption. And using that measure, and the fact that the audits have been random, people have generated a lot of interesting research that's allowed us to say something about the role of elections in corruption, the role of audits in corruption, the responsiveness of the public to finding out about corruption in ways that are a lot more persuasive than we were able to get with the cross-country measures. Good examples besides this, the Brazilian case, right? Brazil is still a country with problems. So can we think about situations where corruption really has been rooted out? I think New York City, or New York, provides one example. New York used to be a tremendously corrupt place in the sense that there was a political machine that ran the city. It was called the Boss. It was run by a guy named Boss Tweed, and it ran the city for good and for evil. It took a lot of rents out of the system for the benefit of the people in the machine. There was this idea of selling positions in the public sector, of making your eligibility for public sector benefits to be contingent on the benefits that you provided in turn to the party. And none of this was strictly above board. A lot of it was illegal. That didn't get fixed internally. I mean, once you have a one-party system that's controlling access to power, controlling the elections, it's really hard for citizens to rise up and say, this has got to stop. So in a federal system, one thing that's possible is there's another unit of government out there that might have an interest in, not necessarily in getting rid of corruption, but in getting rid of the people who are being corrupt. And in this case, it was to the political advantage of a Republican president to sort of knock out a Democratic Party machine. They might have knocked out the Democrats even without it being corrupt, but certainly by creating this higher level oversight, they did reduce corruption.